On the night of August 18th, 1984, 15 people were eliminated at a copper mine in Pike County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Dixon Mine Massacre. All adults, all employees or associates of Fletcher Mining Company. The method was ruthless. Rifles fired from elevated positions around the mine entrance, dynamite used to collapse tunnels with men still inside, and hunting down survivors through August darkness like animals being culled. The perpetrators weren't rival corporations or organized crime syndicates. They were 5 members of the Dixon family, a father and his 4 sons, defending what they believed was rightfully theirs, with violence that shocked a region already hardened to coal wars and labor disputes. The Kentucky State Police would later call it the deadliest property dispute in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't about money alone, wasn't about corporate greed, wasn't even about generations of family hatred. It was about a copper vein discovered on Dixon land in March 1984, worth an estimated $4.5 million, that Fletcher Mining claimed through legal manipulation and surveying disputes, and one man's absolute conviction that claim jumpers deserved death according to codes older than any deed or title registered in county courthouses. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Pike County sprawled across 780 square miles of eastern Kentucky in 1984. Pressed against the West Virginia border, where mountains rose steep and unforgiving, their slopes scarred by a century of coal mining that had made fortunes for companies and left devastation for people who actually lived there. The terrain was spectacularly rugged, ridges covered with second-growth forest rising over 2,500 feet, their valleys narrow and deep, carved by creeks with names like Shelby, Johns, and Blackberry. Population stood around 72,000, most concentrated in Pikeville, the county seat, with the rest scattered across hollows, so remote that some families didn't have electricity until the 1970s. August in eastern Kentucky meant temperatures climbing past 90 degrees during the day, humidity so oppressive you felt like you were breathing through wet cloth, dropping to the low 70s at night when fog rolled through the hollows and turned headlights into useless, diffused glow. The air smelled like diesel from coal trucks, wood smoke from cooking fires, and the metallic tang of exposed rock where mining had stripped away topsoil. At night you could hear the entire county settling, tree frogs screaming, distant dogs barking, the occasional boom of dynamite from mines, running night shifts, normal sounds of a place where extraction industries had dominated life for 5 generations. But 1984 was a catastrophic year for coal country. The industry that had sustained Pike County for 120 years was in free fall, crushed by mechanization that eliminated thousands of jobs, by environmental regulations that shut down marginal operations, by Western surface-mined coal that undercut Appalachian deep-mined prices by 60%. Mines that had employed entire towns now sat abandoned, their portals sealed, their equipment auctioned off, their workers scattered to find jobs that didn't exist. In Pike County, official unemployment hit 31%. but real numbers were closer to 50% when you counted people who'd given up looking, who'd gone on disability, who were surviving on food stamps and the underground economy of barter and illegal work. Men who'd spent their lives underground, breathing coal dust that killed them slowly, destroying their bodies for wages that once meant something, now had nothing. Strip mining had destroyed the landscape, leaving mountains leveled, valleys filled with toxic runoff, land so damaged it would take centuries to recover if it ever did. The economic collapse was total, systemic, a death spiral that nobody in power seemed interested in stopping. Into that wasteland, minerals other than coal suddenly mattered. Copper prices had risen dramatically in the early 1980s, driven by demand from electronics manufacturing and construction industries. A significant copper deposit could mean millions of dollars, enough to save a family, maybe even revitalize a community if managed right. The Dixon family had lived on the same 340 acres in Pike County since 1847, when Walter Dixon's great-great-grandfather claimed land through a Revolutionary War land grant. 5 generations of Dixons had farmed tobacco, raised livestock, cut timber, and done whatever was necessary to survive in mountains that offered beauty but demanded blood. They'd avoided coal mining, watched neighboring families get rich during boom times and go broke during busts, maintained their independence through subsistence agriculture and careful management of resources. The land itself was their wealth, not what could be extracted from it, but what it represented. Continuity, identity, connection to ancestors who'd walked these same ridges for 137 years. That changed in March 1984, when Walter's oldest son Jackson was clearing land for a new tobacco barn and found exposed rock shot through with green and blue streaks that any Kentucky miner recognized immediately as copper ore. Jackson had called his father, who'd called the county extension office, who'd sent someone out to take samples. The assay results came back 2 weeks later. High-grade copper ore, estimated 18,000 tons, recoverable through surface mining, worth approximately $4.5 million at current prices for a family that had never seen that much money in 5 generations combined. That number was transformative, was salvation, was proof that God rewarded faithful stewardship of land. Walter Dixon filed the mining claim properly, followed every regulation, registered with the county clerk, paid the fees, believed he was protected by law and property rights that went back 137 years. What he didn't understand was that mining claims in Kentucky were subject to interpretation, to surveying disputes, to legal challenges from companies with better lawyers and deeper pockets. Fletcher Mining Company, out of Lexington, had been monitoring mineral filings across eastern Kentucky, looking for opportunities as coal declined and other minerals became profitable. When they saw the Dixon claim, saw the assay results showing high-grade copper on property that bordered old coal leases Fletcher owned, they saw opportunity. Fletcher's lawyers argued that the copper vein actually originated on Fletcher-leased land, that the Dixon property only contained the tail end of a deposit that legally belonged to Fletcher under mineral rights, that predated the Dixon family's surface ownership. The argument was technical, complex, based on geological surveys and 19th century lease agreements that most people couldn't understand. But it was also legal, filed properly in court, backed by precedent from dozens of similar cases where mining companies had successfully claimed subsurface rights that surface owners didn't know they'd lost generations ago. Walter Dixon received notice of Fletcher's legal challenge on June 15, 1984. The letter informed him that his mining claim was disputed and he should cease all activity until courts resolved ownership. Walter James Dixon was 61 years old that August, though hard living made him look closer to 75. He stood 6'1", but arthritis had bent his spine, giving him a permanent stoop that made him seem shorter. His face was deeply weathered, creased like old leather, with pale blue eyes that had seen 6 decades of Appalachian poverty and resilience. A thick gray beard covered his jaw and grew down to his chest, never trimmed, never styled, just allowed to grow as God intended. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen, fingers twisted from arthritis, and decades of manual labor that destroyed joints faster than bodies could repair them. A scar ran from his left ear down his neck, disappearing under his collar, a souvenir from 1956, when a tobacco barn collapsed and nearly killed him. Every morning, Walter woke at 4:30 a.m. in the house his grandfather had built in 1903, made coffee in a percolator, older than he was, and sat at the kitchen table reading from a Bible his mother had given him in 1945 before he shipped out to the Pacific. He'd served in the Navy, survived kamikaze attacks in Okinawa, come home with nightmares that still woke him screaming 39 years later. After reading scripture, he'd smoke hand-rolled cigarettes and plan his day, managing 340 acres that his family had worked for 5 generations, land that was everything to him, more valuable than money, more important than life itself. He'd married Elizabeth Ann Combs in 1948, right after coming home from the war. They'd had 4 sons. Jackson was 35 now, built like his father with the same intense work ethic and deep attachment to family, land. Robert was 32, quieter than Jackson, more contemplative, but equally committed to Dixon heritage. Samuel was 29, the most volatile of the brothers, quicker to anger, slower to forgive perceived insults. Thomas was 26, the baby, still trying to prove himself worthy of the Dixon name, still seeking his father's approval in ways that worried Elizabeth because she recognized dangerous need when she saw it. Elizabeth was 59, a thin woman whose face showed every hard year, hands as rough as Walter's from decades of work that never ended, never got easier. What Walter valued most wasn't wealth, though God knew they'd been poor their entire lives, barely surviving most years. What he valued was legacy. The knowledge that 5 generations of Dixon men had worked this land, had defended it, had passed it intact to their sons. The land was their identity, their inheritance, the only thing of value they possessed in a world where men like them owned nothing else. When Fletcher Mining filed their legal challenge, claiming ownership of copper deposits on Dixon property, they weren't just disputing mineral rights. They were attacking 137 years of family history, violating codes about property, and inheritance that ran deeper than any law written in Frankfurt. Walter had consulted an attorney in Pikeville, a young lawyer fresh out of University of Kentucky, who took the case because he needed clients and thought property disputes were straightforward. The attorney reviewed Fletcher's claim, reviewed the Dixon deed, reviewed 19th century mineral leases that Fletcher was citing. Then he'd given Walter news that shattered everything. The mineral rights under Dixon property had been separated from surface rights in 1891, sold to a coal company that eventually became part of Fletcher's holdings through mergers and acquisitions. The Dixon family owned the surface, could farm it, build on it, live on it, but they didn't own what was underground. That belonged to Fletcher legally, according to documents recorded in the county clerk's office 93 years ago. "But my family's been here since 1847, Walter had said. "We never sold no mineral rights." "Your great-great-grandfather did," the attorney explained, "in 1891. Probably needed money, probably didn't think it mattered because coal wasn't being mined here yet, but that sale was legal, was recorded, and under Kentucky law it's still valid. Fletcher owns the subsurface. They have the right to mine copper, even if it means destroying your property in the process." Walter had sat in that attorney's office, understanding that everything he'd believed about property ownership, about family legacy, about rights that should be sacred, was wrong. The law didn't protect him. The law protected corporations with old documents and expensive lawyers. The attorney had offered to fight the case, had said they could argue about the specific boundaries of the mineral rights, about whether the copper vein actually originated on Fletcher land or Dixon land, about whether 1891 agreements should be valid in 1984, but he'd also been honest. Cases like this cost tens of thousands of dollars, took years to resolve, and usually ended with surface owners losing because mineral rights law in Kentucky heavily favored companies over individuals. Walter had walked out of that office on June 22, 1984, and understood that legal options were exhausted before they'd even started. He couldn't afford to fight Fletcher in court. Even if he could, he'd probably lose. And even if he won, Fletcher would appeal, would drag it out, would bankrupt him through legal fees long before any final judgment. The system was rigged, had always been rigged, favored money over justice, corporations over families, documents over heritage. That left one option, the option mountain men had always used when courts failed them: direct action, defense of property through force, making it so expensive and dangerous for Fletcher to mine that copper that they'd give up and go away. Walter knew that meant violence, meant blood, meant consequences, but he also knew that some things mattered more than staying out of prison, and family land was one of them. Jackson Walter Dixon was 35 years old that summer. Though the lines around his eyes and the gray in his beard made him look older, he stood 6'2", broad through the shoulders from decades of farm work, with arms roped with muscle built from hauling hay bales and wrestling equipment. His face was angular like his father's, with the same pale blue eyes that seemed to see through whatever you were saying to truth underneath. He kept his brown hair cut short, his beard trimmed neat, and moved with deliberate precision that came from understanding that farming required constant attention to detail, that one mistake could cost you a season's crop or your life. Every morning, Jackson woke at 5 in the house he'd built on his father's property, made breakfast for his wife Sarah and their 3 children, then spent his day working land that he'd believed would someday be his, until Fletcher Mining destroyed that future with a legal filing. Jackson was methodical, patient, the kind of man who planned 5 steps ahead and rarely made mistakes. His father had taught him that successful farming required intelligence as much as hard work, that the families who survived were those who adapted, who thought strategically, who protected what was theirs. Now Jackson was applying those lessons to a different kind of problem: how to defend family land from a corporation that had law on its side but not morality. Robert James Dixon was 32, same height as Jackson, but built leaner, rangier, with a nervous energy that made him seem like he was always calculating something. He had the Dixon features, the angular face, the intense eyes. But where Jackson was steady and deliberate, Robert was volatile, quicker to see conspiracy, faster to assume bad faith. A scar bisected his right eyebrow, a souvenir from a bar fight in Pikeville when he was 24, a reminder that Robert's temper had cost him before and would probably cost him again. He'd married young at 20, had 2 daughters, but his wife had left him in 1981, taken the girls to Ohio, and he hadn't seen them since. That abandonment had hardened Robert, made him angrier, more willing to see fights where others saw negotiations. He lived in a trailer on the Dixon property, spent his evenings drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon and reading about corporate land grabs, about how mining companies had stolen from Appalachian families for generations, about Ruby Ridge and Waco, events that hadn't happened yet, but that Robert would later see as proof of everything he believed about government and corporate tyranny. Samuel David Dixon was 29, built thicker than his brothers, stockier, with a barrel chest and shoulders like tree trunks. He had the same features but darker coloring, brown eyes instead of blue, hair that was almost black. Samuel had always been the fighter of the family, the one who solved problems with fists first and thinking second, whose temper was legendary in Pike County. He'd done time in county jail twice, once for assault in 1978, once for destruction of property in 1980, both incidents involving perceived disrespect that Samuel had answered with violence. He'd never married, lived in a cabin he'd built himself on the Dixon property, spent most of his time alone, working land and nursing grievances that grew larger in isolation. Thomas Michael Dixon was 26, the youngest, standing 6'0", lean and rangy, with the kind of energy that came from still believing the future held possibilities beyond Pike County poverty. He had lighter hair than his brothers, brown with blonde highlights, and a face that hadn't yet been hardened by decades of disappointment. Thomas had tried to leave once, driven to Lexington with dreams of construction work and a different life, lasted 9 months before coming home defeated by a world that didn't value mountain people, that heard his accent and assumed he was stupid, that offered minimum wage and expected gratitude. He'd come back to the family land with his pride damaged, desperate to prove he belonged, that he was as tough and capable as his older brothers. The copper discovery had been Thomas's validation, his contribution to family fortune, his chance to matter. Now Fletcher Mining was trying to steal that away. And Thomas took it personally in ways his older brothers understood was dangerous. The 4 Dixon brothers had grown up understanding that family land was sacred, that 5 generations had worked and died to pass it intact, that their responsibility was to protect it and pass it to their own sons. When Fletcher Mining filed their claim, when they produced 93-year-old documents that said they owned what was under Dixon soil, the brothers saw it as more than legal dispute. They saw it as theft, as violation of everything they'd been raised to believe about property and heritage and family responsibility. Walter had gathered his sons on July 1st, 3 weeks after receiving notice of Fletcher's claim, 2 weeks after consulting the attorney, who said legal options were limited and expensive. They'd sat at the kitchen table where every important Dixon family decision had been made for 81 years, the same table where Walter's father had planned resistance to union organizers in the 1930s, where his grandfather had made decisions about surviving the Depression. "The copper is ours," Walter had said. "We found it on our land my family's worked since 1847. Fletcher Mining is trying to steal it using legal tricks and 93-year-old documents. My great-great-grandfather probably couldn't even read when he signed them. The attorney says we can't fight them in court. Says mineral rights law favors corporations. Says even if we spend everything we have, we'll probably lose." Jackson had spoken first. "So what do we do? Let them mine our land? Destroy our property? Take $4.5 million that should be ours?" Walter had looked at his 4 sons, at men he'd raised to value family and land above everything else, who'd learned from childhood that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of cost. "We make it so expensive and dangerous for Fletcher to mine that copper that they give up," Walter had said. "We defend what's ours the way mountain men always have when courts fail us." The 4 brothers had understood immediately what their father was proposing. Robert had smiled. Samuel had nodded. Thomas had looked excited and scared simultaneously. Jackson had closed his eyes, understanding they were about to cross a line that would destroy their family. The copper deposit on Dixon land wasn't just valuable, it was exceptional. Geological surveys that Fletcher Mining had commissioned showed a vein approximately 400 feet long, 80 feet wide, running at a depth between 30 and 60 feet below surface. The ore, assayed at 3.2% copper content, high grade by any standard, with additional traces of silver and gold that added value. Total estimated recoverable copper, 18,000 tons. At August 1984, prices of approximately $65 per pound. That translated to $23.4 million in gross copper value. After extraction costs, processing, transportation, and refining, net profit would be approximately $4.5 million. For Fletcher Mining, a mid-sized company grossing $40 million annually, that represented a significant but not transformative project. For the Dixon family, who'd never collectively earned that much money in 137 years of farming, that $4.5 million represented everything. Was generational wealth, was security for children and grandchildren, was proof that God rewarded faithful stewardship of land. The discovery itself had been accidental. Jackson had been clearing land in March 1984, using a backhoe to level ground for a new tobacco barn. When the bucket had hit rock and pulled up chunks of stone shot through with green and blue mineral deposits, most people would have ignored it, would have assumed it was just colorful rock. But Jackson had grown up in coal country, had seen enough geology to recognize oxidized copper ore when he saw it. He'd called his father, who'd examined the samples and understood immediately what they'd found. Walter had called the county extension office, which had sent a geologist out to take samples and conduct preliminary surveys. The geologist's report, delivered 3 weeks later, had confirmed the deposit's significance and estimated its value. Walter had filed the mining claim on April 12, 1984, following every regulation, believing that proper procedure protected rights. The family had celebrated, had talked about what they'd do with the money, how they'd modernize the farm, buy new equipment, maybe even send grandchildren to college, break the cycle of poverty that had defined Dixon lives for 5 generations. Thomas had talked about buying a new truck. Samuel had wanted to buy the adjacent property that bordered theirs. Robert had dreamed about getting his daughters back, proving to his ex-wife that he could provide. Jackson had been more practical, had wanted to invest carefully, create lasting security. Walter had said they'd tithe to the church, help neighbors in need, be responsible stewards of blessing God had provided. Those dreams had lasted 8 weeks. From April 12th, when they filed the claim, to June 15th, when Fletcher Mining filed their legal challenge. Fletcher's claim was based on a document dated November 3, 1891, recorded in Pike County Clerk's office, showing that James Dixon, Walter's great-great-grandfather, had sold mineral rights under his property to Elkhorn Coal Company for $500. The document was legitimate, properly recorded, legally binding. Elkhorn Coal had been absorbed by Kentucky Consolidated Mining in 1923, which had merged with Fletcher Mining in 1967, transferring all mineral rights in the process. Fletcher's lawyers argued that the copper vein, while discovered on Dixon's surface property, originated geologically on land where Fletcher owned mineral rights, making the entire deposit Fletcher property under Kentucky's mineral rights laws. The Dixon family could continue farming the surface. Fletcher would compensate them for surface disturbance during mining operations, but the copper itself belonged to Fletcher. The compensation offered was $15,000, a pittance compared to $4.5 million in copper value. Walter had rejected the offer immediately, had told Fletcher's representatives to leave his property, had said he'd fight them in court. But fighting in court required money the Dixons didn't have, required lawyers who charged $200 per hour for work that could take years, required faith in a system that had never protected people like them. By mid-July, Walter understood that legal options were exhausted. Fletcher Mining had the law on their side, had documents proving ownership, had resources to fight indefinitely. The Dixons had anger, had desperation, had belief that property rights should mean something beyond what courts said they meant. On July 15th, Fletcher Mining had sent a survey crew to the Dixon property to mark boundaries and begin preliminary assessment for mining operations. Walter had met them at the property line with a shotgun, had told them to leave, had said they weren't welcome on Dixon land, regardless of what courts might eventually rule. The survey crew had left, had reported the incident to Fletcher management, had triggered a response that escalated everything. Fletcher had obtained a court order on July 22nd, allowing them access to the property for surveying and mineral assessment, backed by county sheriff's authority to enforce the order if necessary. Sheriff's deputies had accompanied Fletcher's crew on July 25th, had stood by while surveyors marked the property, had made it clear that Walter would be arrested if he interfered with court-ordered activities. Walter had watched from his porch, shotgun across his knees, watching strangers mark his land for destruction, watching the law protect corporations while abandoning families. That was the moment when something had broken inside Walter Dixon. When he'd understood that every principle he'd been taught about property rights and justice and American freedom was a lie. When he'd decided that if law wouldn't protect him, he'd protect himself through older methods that preceded courts and judges and legal systems designed to favor money over morality. Fletcher Mining began operations on Dixon property on August 1st, 1984. Despite Walter's protests, despite his threats, despite his absolute conviction that they were violating sacred property rights. The company had obtained all necessary permits, had court orders authorizing access, had sheriff's deputies standing by to enforce those orders if the Dixon family interfered. At 7:00 a.m. on that Thursday morning, 3 Fletcher trucks rolled onto Dixon land carrying survey equipment, drilling rigs, and 12 workers who'd been hired specifically for this project. Walter stood on his porch watching, shotgun visible but not raised, understanding that if he fired on them now, he'd be arrested immediately, would lose everything without accomplishing anything. Elizabeth stood beside him, crying quietly, watching strangers invade land her family had protected for 5 generations. The Fletcher crew set up operations near where Jackson had discovered the copper vein, began drilling test holes to confirm the deposit's extent and plan extraction strategy. The drilling was loud, invasive, mechanical sounds that violated the quiet Walter had known his entire life. Diesel generators running, drill bits grinding through rock, men shouting instructions, completely indifferent to the fact that they were destroying a family's heritage. Over the next 2 weeks, Fletcher's operation expanded. They brought in more equipment, more workers, began clearing trees to make room for mining operations. They excavated a test pit, extracting ore samples that confirmed the deposit's value. They marked boundaries for the full-scale mining operation that would require removing 40 feet of topsoil across 3 acres, essentially strip mining the land, leaving it permanently scarred. Walter watched all of this, documenting it with photographs, writing down names of workers, recording license plate numbers, gathering intelligence the way he'd been trained in the Navy. Jackson, Robert, Samuel, and Thomas watched with him, rage building daily as strangers destroyed land they'd believed was protected by law and heritage. Elizabeth tried to convince Walter to accept Fletcher's $15,000 compensation, to let it go, to understand they couldn't fight a corporation with lawyers and court orders. But Walter couldn't let it go, couldn't accept that 93-year-old documents signed by an ancestor who probably couldn't read gave a corporation the right to destroy everything 5 generations had built. By mid-August, Fletcher's crew had grown to 15 workers, running 2 shifts, advancing the operation toward full production. They'd brought in a mobile office trailer, portable toilets, security lighting that stayed on all night. The Dixon property was being transformed into an industrial site, and there was nothing Walter could do about it legally. On August 10th, Walter called his sons to the barn behind his house. The structure was old, built in 1903, used for equipment storage now. Inside, Walter had spread maps of the property across a workbench, marked with locations of Fletcher's operations positions of workers, schedules he'd observed. He'd also assembled weapons, more than his sons had expected. 4 hunting rifles, 3 shotguns, 2 handguns, boxes of ammunition, dynamite left over from stump removal projects. "This is what's happening," Walter said without preamble. "Fletcher Mining is stealing our land under color of law. They're destroying 3 acres that my great-great-grandfather cleared, that 5 generations have worked. They're taking $4.5 million worth of copper that should secure our grandchildren's futures. Courts won't help us. Lawyers want money. We don't have to fight cases they say we'll lose anyway. Law has failed completely, which means we're back to the old way, the mountain way. We defend what's ours through force." Jackson stared at his father. "Dad, you're talking about killing people. Workers who are just doing their jobs." "Not just workers," Walter said. "Thieves operating under legal cover. They know this land isn't theirs morally. They're hiding behind court orders and old documents to steal what belongs to us. That makes them criminals. And criminals get dealt with according to mountain justice." Robert spoke first, voice tight with anger that had been building for 6 weeks. "I'm with you, Dad. Fletcher's been stealing from Appalachian families for 100 years. Time somebody made them pay for it." Samuel nodded, that wild energy about him that meant violence was close to the surface. "They marked our land like they own it, brought their equipment, their workers, acting like we don't matter. We show them we matter." Thomas looked excited and terrified, understanding what his father was proposing, wanting to prove himself worthy of the Dixon name. "Whatever you need, Dad, I'm in." Jackson was silent, face showing the internal struggle between loyalty to family and understanding of consequences. "Dad, this is different from defending property from trespassers. This is planning to kill 15 men who have court orders saying they're allowed to be here. We do this. We're not defending our rights. We're committing mass murder, federal charges, death penalty, destroying our family more completely than Fletcher ever could." Walter met his oldest son's eyes. "We're already destroyed. Fletcher's taken our future, taken the one chance our family had to break out of poverty, done it legally but immorally. So we have 2 choices. We accept that law protects corporations over families, that our heritage means nothing, that 137 years of Dixon blood and sweat don't matter, or we fight back the only way left to us, make it so expensive in blood that Fletcher and every other mining company thinks twice before stealing from mountain families." The 5 Dixon men stood in that barn, surrounded by weapons and maps, making a decision that would define their lives and mark Kentucky history. The temperature outside was 94 degrees, humidity making it hard to breathe, but inside the barn it felt cold, like something essential had frozen in the space between right and wrong. Jackson finally spoke. "If we do this, we do it smart. Not a massacre, a message. We hit them when they're concentrated, when we can maximize casualties and minimize our exposure. We make it look like an accident if possible. Mine collapse, equipment failure, something that might give us deniability." Walter shook his head. "No accidents, no deniability. I want Fletcher Mining to know exactly why 15 of their workers died. I want every mining company in Kentucky to understand that stealing from Dixon land has consequences. This isn't about getting away with it. This is about sending a message written in blood that lasts generations. The family code, the mountain code Walter had been raised with, said you defended your property from anyone who tried to take it. You settled disputes through direct action when courts failed. You made examples of people who violated sacred boundaries. That code had governed Appalachian life for 200 years, had survived because it worked when nothing else did, when law was distant and corrupt and unavailable to poor people. Walter was applying that code to a situation it hadn't been designed for, industrialized mining backed by legal authority, but in his mind the principle remained valid. Your land, your rules, your justice. On August 15th, 3 days before the massacre, Walter drove to the Fletcher operation site, parked at the property line, walked to where the foreman was coordinating work. The foreman was a man named David Fletcher, no relation to the company owners, 45 years old, from Hazard, who'd worked mining operations for 20 years. Walter approached him directly. "You need to shut down this operation," Walter said. "You're stealing from my family." "We got court orders," David said. "Everything we're doing is legal, Mr. Dixon. I understand you're upset, but this is between you and Fletcher's lawyers, not between you and my crew." "Legal doesn't make it right," Walter said. "My great-great-grandfather signed away mineral rights in 1891 probably because he needed money to survive, probably didn't understand what he was doing, probably couldn't even read the document. That signature doesn't give you the right to destroy my land 93 years later." David's face showed sympathy, but no flexibility. "I'm sorry about your situation, but I got a job to do. I got 15 men working here who got families to feed. We're following the law." "Then you're following the wrong law," Walter said. "And there's consequences for that. You got until August 18th to clear out. After that, anyone still on my property answers to me, not to courts." David had reported the threat to Fletcher management, who'd reported it to Pike County Sheriff, who'd sent deputies to talk to Walter. The deputies had warned him that threatening workers was illegal, that interfering with court-ordered mining operations would result in arrest. Walter had listened, said nothing, waited for them to leave. The preparation took 3 days, from August 15th to August 18th, methodical and careful, despite the compressed timeline. Walter applied military discipline learned in the Navy, understanding that successful operations required planning and coordination. They met every evening in the barn, reviewing maps, discussing tactics, preparing weapons. The arsenal was assembled from family collections and purchases made carefully across multiple counties. Walter's Winchester Model 70 in 30-06, his deer rifle for 40 years. Jackson's Remington 700 in 308, accurate to 600 yards with the scope he'd mounted. Robert's Marlin 336 lever action in 30-30, faster firing rate for close work. Samuel's Mossberg 500 shotgun, 12 gauge, devastating at close range. Thomas had a Ruger Mini 14, semi-automatic rifle in 223, lightweight and fast firing. 5 firearms for 5 men, plus Walter's .45 Colt 1911 from World War II, and a .38 special revolver that Robert kept for backup. 7 weapons total, enough for sustained engagement if Fletcher's crew fought back. Ammunition was purchased across 6 different stores in 4 counties, never more than 2 boxes at any location. 8 boxes of 30-06, 6 boxes of 308, 5 boxes of 30 to 30, 10 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot, 12 boxes of 223. Walter kept receipts, documentation that would later prove premeditation, but some part of him still believed in record-keeping even while planning mass murder. They also acquired explosives. Walter had 40 sticks of dynamite left from stump removal projects, old, but still functional. Samuel knew how to wire blasting caps, had learned from coal miners, understood how to create timed charges or command detonated explosives. The plan was to use dynamite to collapse the mine entrance after Fletcher's crew went underground for their night shift, trapping them, eliminating them without direct confrontation. If any workers escaped, rifles would handle them. The operation was planned for August 18th, a Saturday night when Fletcher ran a skeleton crew, just 15 workers doing maintenance and advancing the test tunnels. Fewer workers meant easier engagement, less chance of witnesses escaping, cleaner message. Walter had observed Fletcher's schedule for 2 weeks, knew they ran an 8 o'clock p.m. to 4 o'clock a.m. shift on weekends, knew the crew went underground around 9 o'clock p.m. and stayed down for hours. The Dixon plan was to wait until the crew was deep in the tunnels, then collapse the entrance with explosives, sealing them underground. If they tried to dig out, rifles would be waiting. If they had an alternate exit Walter didn't know about, they'd be hunted down. Either way, none of them would leave Dixon property alive. Walter didn't discuss the morality of what they were planning, didn't acknowledge that 15 workers were just employees, following orders, that they had families, futures, rights to life that superseded property disputes. In Walter's mind, they'd chosen their side by accepting jobs with Fletcher, by implementing corporate theft, by invading Dixon land, despite warnings. That made them combatants, not civilians, and combatants accepted risks. On August 17th, they gathered one final time. Walter laid out the timeline. Tomorrow at 8:45 p.m., we position ourselves around the mine site. At 9:30 p.m., after the crew is underground, Samuel detonates charges at the main entrance, collapsing it. We maintain positions around the perimeter, rifles ready, ensuring nobody escapes. If they dig out, if they have another exit, we engage and eliminate. No mercy, no hesitation, no survivors. This isn't murder, it's defense of property against thieves operating under color of law. Jackson looked sick, face pale despite August heat. Dad, those are men with families. They're not corporate executives. They're workers making $12 an hour. Walter's face hardened. They chose to work for Fletcher. They chose to participate in theft. Actions have consequences. We draw the line here, defend what's ours, make sure every mining company in Kentucky knows that Dixon land is sacred. Robert and Samuel showed no hesitation, were ready, maybe eager. Thomas was nervous but committed. Jackson nodded slowly, accepting that family loyalty meant following his father into darkness, even when every moral instinct screamed that this was wrong. They synchronized watches, confirmed everyone understood their positions, checked weapons. One final time. At 7 o'clock p.m. on August 18th, 1984, 5 Dixon men left their homes, told their families they'd be back late, drove toward the mine site where 15 workers were about to learn that property disputes in Appalachia were settled with blood, not courts. The temperature had dropped to 76 degrees by the time the Dixon men positioned themselves around Fletcher Mining's operation site, but humidity remained oppressive, the air thick enough that breathing felt difficult. No moon tonight, just stars obscured by clouds that promised rain but wouldn't deliver. The mine site was lit by portable work lights, diesel generators humming, creating an island of industrial brightness in mountain darkness. Walter watched from an elevated position 200 yards east, Winchester across his knees, observing Fletcher's night crew arrive at 8:00 p.m. 15 workers in hard hats and coveralls, carrying lunch pails and thermoses, normal men doing normal jobs, completely unaware that 5 armed men surrounded them with intent to kill. Walter felt his hands shaking slightly, adrenaline and something else, maybe recognition that he was about to cross a line that separated property defense from mass murder, that what he'd told himself was justice was actually vengeance dressed in moral language. But he'd committed to this course, had convinced his sons to follow him, couldn't turn back without admitting everything he believed about property rights and family heritage was worth less than the lives of men he'd never met. Jackson was positioned 150 yards north, Remington 700 ready, watching the mine entrance through his scope. Robert had the south approach, Marlin 336 loaded. Samuel covered the west with his shotgun. Thomas was mobile, Ruger Mini 14 in hand, ready to respond to anyone who tried to escape. At 9:15 p.m., Fletcher's crew began descending into the test shaft, one by one, headlamps bobbing as they climbed down ladders into tunnels that extended 60 feet underground. Walter counted them, confirming all 15 were accounted for. The crew worked in teams, some advancing the tunnel face with drilling and blasting, others hauling ore samples to the surface, others maintaining ventilation and safety systems. Once underground, they'd be concentrated, vulnerable, trapped if the entrance collapsed. Samuel was positioned near the mine entrance, had planted dynamite charges at strategic points in the shaft structure, had wired them to a detonator he controlled from 50 yards away. The plan was simple, brutal, effective. Wait until all workers were deep underground, collapse the entrance, seal them in, let them suffocate or crush them with falling rock. Anyone who survived would be shot when they tried to dig out. At 9:28 p.m., Walter gave the signal. 3 short flashes with his flashlight, visible to all his sons, the command to execute. Samuel pressed the detonator. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder, panic rising. Still nothing. Misfire, a bad connection, a charge that didn't detonate. The most carefully planned element of their operation had failed, leaving them with only rifles and a decision about whether to abort or adapt. Walter made the decision in seconds. We go direct. Rifles. Anyone who comes out of that mine, we engage. We can't let them escape. Can't let witnesses survive. His voice carried across the radio they'd bought for coordination. Cheap Motorola walkie-talkies from Walmart. At 9:35 p.m., one of Fletcher's workers emerged from the mine shaft, climbing the ladder, probably coming up for supplies or to report on progress. Samuel, positioned closest, raised his Mossberg and fired. The blast echoed across the hollow, impossibly loud. The worker falling backward into the shaft, screaming, disappearing into darkness. Inside the mine, Keio Chaos erupted, workers shouting, asking what happened, if there was a collapse, what's going on, then understanding, voices saying there's someone shooting, get down, get to cover. Fletcher's crew wasn't armed, wasn't prepared for violence, were just workers expecting another routine night underground. But they were also Kentucky men, mountain people who understood violence, who made quick decisions under pressure. Some tried to climb out, thinking they could run. Others went deeper into the mine, seeking cover, planning to wait out whatever was happening above. Either choice led to death. Walter opened fire on a worker who emerged from the shaft, his Winchester barking twice, both rounds hitting center mass. Jackson engaged another target, his Remington taking a man down before he'd cleared the ladder. Robert and Thomas fired on workers trying to flee toward the equipment, cutting them down in the open. 5 Dixon men with rifles against 15 unarmed miners. The mathematics were brutal, one-sided. Execution rather than combat. The shooting continued for 8 minutes that felt like hours. Muzzle flashes brilliant in the darkness. Thunder rolling across the hollow. Brass casings piling up around positions where Dixon men fired methodically at targets, trying desperately to escape. Workers who'd been underground when the shooting started made terrible decisions under pressure, decisions that seemed reasonable in panic, but were fatal in execution. 3 men tried to run for the vehicles, parked 100 yards from the mine entrance, thinking they could reach trucks and drive away. They made it maybe 50 yards before concentrated fire from Walter, Jackson, and Thomas cut them down. Another worker tried to hide behind mining equipment, a portable air compressor, thinking metal would provide cover. Robert's .30-30 rounds punched through thin metal like it wasn't there. The man fell, tried to crawl toward better cover, took another round, and stopped moving. 2 workers attempted to surrender, climbing out of the mine with hands raised, shouting that they gave up. Please don't shoot, they were unarmed. Samuel shot them both anyway, Mossberg roaring. Buckshot at 40 yards, leaving nothing that resembled mercy. Jackson witnessed that execution from his position, saw 2 men murdered while surrendering, felt something break inside him. Dad, this is slaughter. They're surrendering. No witnesses. Walter's voice crackled over the radio. We committed when we fired the first shot. Can't leave anyone alive to testify. Inside the mine shaft, the remaining workers faced an impossible choice. Stay underground and hope the shooters left, or try to escape and risk being shot in the open. Most chose to stay, retreating deep into the tunnels, shutting off their headlamps, trying to be invisible. But Walter had anticipated that, had brought the dynamite Samuel had failed to detonate remotely. At 9:52 p.m., Walter and Samuel approached the mine entrance, moving carefully, rifles ready for anyone who might emerge. They planted charges at the shaft opening, set timers for 2 minutes, retreated to safe distance. At 9:54 p.m., the explosives detonated, 60 feet of tunnel collapsing, tons of rock and earth sealing the entrance, trapping whoever remained alive underground. The explosion was massive, shook the ground, sent a cloud of dust rolling across the site. When the dust cleared, the mine entrance was gone, replaced by a pile of rubble 30 feet deep. Beneath that rubble, in tunnels now sealed from air and light, 9 Fletcher workers were trapped, alive but doomed, with maybe 6 hours of breathable air and no way to dig themselves out before suffocating. Walter stood looking at the collapsed entrance, listening to faint sounds of men screaming from under tons of rock, men calling for help that wouldn't come, men understanding they were going to die slow deaths in darkness. He waited to feel guilt or horror, felt only satisfaction that the job was nearly done. Jackson approached his father, face twisted in anguish. "Dad, there's men buried alive down there. We can dig them out, call for help. Stop this before it gets worse." "It's already worse," Walter said. "We've killed 6 workers in the open. Can't stop now. Can't leave witnesses. Those men underground are already dead, just don't know it yet." Robert appeared from the south, Marlin smoking. "I count 6 bodies visible, plus however many are buried. That's maybe 12 dead. We had 15 workers on site tonight. Where's the other 3? Walter consulted the tally he'd been keeping mentally. 3 unaccounted for, probably ran into the woods when the shooting started, probably trying to reach the road. Flag down help. We need to find them before they get to civilization. Samuel and Thomas, you take the north trail toward the county road. Jackson and Robert, check the south route. I'll cover the access road. Anyone you find, eliminate them. No exceptions, no mercy. We're past the point where mercy means anything." The 5 Dixon men split up, moving through August darkness, hunting survivors, transforming from property defenders into something else, entirely, something that had no redemption, waiting at the end. Just blood and consequences and prison cells or execution chambers. Behind them, the mine site burned. Equipment set ablaze to destroy evidence. Portable office trailer engulfed. Vehicles torched. Everything Fletcher had built being reduced to ash and twisted metal. The message Walter wanted to send was being written in fire and blood and bodies. 9 Fletcher workers remained trapped underground, sealed by tons of collapsed rock, oxygen depleting with every breath. The tunnels extended roughly 200 feet from the entrance, branching into 3 separate shafts where different teams had been working. When the entrance collapsed at 9:54 p.m., the workers had been scattered across these tunnels, some near the face advancing excavation, others hauling ore samples, others maintaining ventilation systems that were now useless. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, chaos had given way to horrific understanding. They were buried alive, trapped behind debris they couldn't move, with air that wouldn't last until morning. The mine foreman, David Fletcher, gathered the surviving workers in the main tunnel, took inventory using the few headlamps still functioning. 9 men accounted for, 6 missing, presumed dead on the surface. The workers ranged in age from 22 to 54, included fathers, sons, brothers, men whose only crime was accepting jobs that paid $12 per hour in a county where jobs didn't exist. David tried to organize them, tried to assess options. "We got maybe 6 hours of air," he said. "We can try digging out, but that's 30 feet of rock. Or we wait, hope someone realizes what happened and sends rescue crews." But even as he said it, David understood rescue wasn't coming, understood the collapse wasn't accidental. The workers had heard gunfire before the explosion, had understood someone was shooting at their co-workers who'd tried to escape. This was intentional, was murder, was the Dixon family making good on threats to defend their property through violence. "We're gonna die down here," one worker said, voice breaking. 22 years old, married 3 months, wife pregnant with their first child. They collapsed the entrance on purpose. They're not letting anyone out alive. Panic spread through the group. Men who'd faced mine collapses before, but never as murder victims. Men who understood the mathematics of oxygen consumption versus time. David tried to maintain order, tried to keep them calm, to conserve air. But terror was infectious. Some workers prayed. Others wrote notes to families, using paper from lunch bags and pencils, from toolboxes, goodbye messages they hoped would somehow reach loved ones. Others just sat in darkness, headlamps off to conserve batteries, waiting for suffocation that came slower than anyone imagined. Above ground, Walter Dixon listened to faint sounds of men dying, heard their screams getting weaker, heard them calling for help that would never arrive. He felt nothing. They'd chosen to work for Fletcher, chosen to participate in theft. Consequences. 3 Fletcher workers had escaped when the shooting started, had run into the forest surrounding the mine site, were now moving through August darkness trying to reach the county road, where they might flag down help. The youngest was Marcus Webb, 24 years old, from Pikeville, had been working mining jobs for 6 years, supporting his mother, who had black lung from working in company housing, doing laundry. He'd heard the first shotgun blast, had been near the mine entrance when Samuel killed that initial worker, had understood immediately that this wasn't an accident or equipment failure but deliberate violence. Marcus had run east forest, not toward the road, because that seemed too obvious, but deeper into mountains where he thought he could hide until morning. The second escapee was Dennis Combs, 31, Walter Dixon's distant cousin through marriage, a connection he'd never mentioned because jobs were scarce and family drama was irrelevant when you needed work. Dennis had run south, following a creek bed, thinking water would mask his trail, that darkness would protect him. The third survivor was Tommy Vance, 28, who'd tried to help wounded workers before realizing the shooting wouldn't stop, that staying meant dying. Tommy ran north toward where he thought the county road was, maybe 2 miles through forest, running blind in darkness, branches tearing his face, terror overriding pain. Samuel and Thomas Dixon tracked north, following sounds of someone crashing through underbrush, moving fast, careless, panicked. They found Tommy Vance after 20 minutes, cornered him against a cliff face where the terrain gave him nowhere left to run. Tommy raised his hands, breathing hard, bleeding from a dozen scratches. "Please," Tommy gasped. "I got a daughter, 4 years old. I'm just trying to make a living." "You worked for Fletcher," Thomas said. "Helped them steal from my family. That makes you guilty." "But I didn't know," Tommy protested. "Just took a job they offered. Didn't know about your property dispute." "Ignorance isn't innocence," Samuel said. Raised his Mossberg, fired once. Tommy Vance fell backward over the cliff, dropped 40 feet onto rocks below, died on impact. Samuel and Thomas looked over the edge, confirmed the body, moved on to find the other 2. Robert and Jackson tracked south, following the creek where Dennis Combs ran, found him hiding behind a fallen log, shivering despite August heat, crying quietly. Dennis saw them approach, recognized Jackson from family gatherings years ago. "Jackson, please. We're family. Distant, but still blood. Don't do this." Jackson's rifle wavered, moral resistance surfacing. Robert stepped forward. Marlin aimed. "Family or not, you violated Dixon property. Shot Dennis twice, left him face down in the creek, water running red." Jackson stood there, watching his cousin die, understanding complicity. Marcus. Webb ran east for 2 hours, putting distance between himself and the mine site, hearing occasional gunshots that meant the Dixon family was hunting survivors, executing anyone they found. He'd worked mines since age 18, understood mountains, knew how to navigate by stars and terrain features. His plan was to reach the national forest boundary maybe 5 miles east, where there'd be hiking trails, maybe campers, someone who could help. But moving through Kentucky forest at night was slow, dangerous, every step risking injury from unseen obstacles. At 12:47 a.m., Marcus stopped to rest, found a hiding spot under a rock overhang, tried to catch his breath and think clearly. He'd witnessed murder, had seen Samuel Dixon shoot surrendering workers, had heard explosions that collapsed the mine entrance, had understood his co-workers were dead or dying. If he reached civilization, if he testified, the Dixon family would spend life in prison or get executed. But testifying meant admitting he'd survived while 15 co-workers died, meant living with guilt, meant becoming the witness whose testimony destroyed a family, even if that family had become murderers. Marcus sat in darkness, making calculations about survival versus justice, about what he owed to dead co-workers versus what he owed to his own mother, who depended on his income. While he hesitated, Walter Dixon tracked him. Walter had served in the Pacific, had learned tracking from Marine training, understood how to follow someone through darkness by sound and disturbance. He'd been following Marcus for an hour, staying back, waiting for the younger man to stop, to give Walter a clean shot. At 1:15 a.m., Walter found Marcus's hiding spot, approached silently, Winchester raised. Marcus saw movement, tried to run, made it maybe 10 feet before Walter fired. The .30-06 round took Marcus in the back, spinning him around, dropping him hard. Walter walked up, looked down at a kid who couldn't have been older than 25, who was trying to crawl away despite a wound that was clearly fatal. "Why?" Marcus gasped. "We were just working. Just trying to survive in a county with no jobs. You worked for thieves," Walter said. "Helped Fletcher steal what belonged to my family. That makes you complicit." Marcus died 30 seconds later, alone in darkness, killed by a man who believed property rights justified 15 murders. Walter stood over the body, waited for horror or regret, felt only exhausted certainty that he'd defended what was his. The courts had failed. That violence was the only language corporations understood. He was wrong about all of it, but wouldn't understand that until years later in a prison cell when consequences finally caught up to justifications. The first 911 call came at 6:23 a.m. from a truck driver who'd seen smoke rising from the direction of Fletcher Mining's operation site and drove closer to investigate. What he found exceeded any disaster scenario he could have imagined. 6 bodies scattered around the mine entrance, all shot multiple times. Equipment burning, vehicles destroyed, portable office trailer reduced to ash and twisted metal. The mine entrance collapsed, tons of rock where a shaft had been, and faint sounds of someone screaming from underneath, though by the time the driver called 911 that sound had stopped, the last trapped worker having suffocated sometime around 5:30 a.m. By 7 o'clock a.m., Pike County Sheriff's Department, Kentucky State Police, and mine rescue teams had descended on what would become the largest crime scene in eastern Kentucky history. What they found was carnage on a scale law enforcement had never confronted in the region. 6 bodies on the surface, all with rifle or shotgun wounds. 9 bodies eventually recovered from the collapsed mine, all dead from suffocation after being deliberately trapped underground. 3 more bodies found in the surrounding forest, tracked down and executed while trying to escape. 15 deaths total at a single location, all in one night. All killed during a property dispute that should have been settled in courts. Sheriff James Tucker was 52 years old, had worn the badge for 24 years in Pike County, thought he'd seen every variation of violence these mountains produced. Standing at that mine site, looking at bodies, at the collapsed entrance, at evidence of systematic massacre, he felt his understanding fundamentally shift. Kentucky State Police. Captain Michael Barnes arrived at 8:45 a.m., took command, began coordinating what would become one of the largest investigations in state history. Barnes was 49 years old, 23 years in law enforcement, specialized in homicide and violent crime. He walked the perimeter, studied shell casings, counted shooting positions, reconstructed the attack. Multiple shooters, coordinated fire from elevated positions, planned ambush, no chance for victims to defend themselves or escape. This was execution, pure and simple. Premeditated murder of 15 people over a mining dispute. The evidence against the Dixon family was overwhelming before investigators even started collecting it. Witnesses from Fletcher Mining identified Walter Dixon's threats from August 15th. Shell casings recovered from 5 different positions matched common hunting rifles. Tire tracks leading to and from the site matched Dixon family vehicles. Most damning, one worker who'd been shot but survived long enough to give a statement to first responders identified Samuel Dixon as the shooter before dying from his wounds. By noon, warrants were issued for Walter, Jackson, Robert, Samuel, and Thomas Dixon. 15 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, use of explosives, terrorism under state law. The warrants authorized deadly force, meaning police could shoot on sight if the Dixons resisted. The manhunt began immediately. By 2 p.m. on August 19th, law enforcement had surrounded the Dixon property with overwhelming force. 80 state police, sheriff's deputies from 3 counties, FBI agents from Lexington, tactical teams in full gear, helicopters overhead, snipers on ridge lines, armored vehicles blocking every access road. The Dixon family wasn't going anywhere, wasn't escaping, wasn't repeating the property defense that had killed 15 people. Captain Barnes used a bullhorn from 400 yards. Walter Dixon, this is Kentucky State Police. You and your sons are wanted for 15 counts of murder. You have 1 hour to surrender peacefully. Come out unarmed, hands visible, or we will use deadly force. Inside the Dixon house, Walter sat at his kitchen table with his 4 sons, Elizabeth crying in the bedroom. understanding that her family had been destroyed by her husband's decisions. Jackson spoke first. "Dad, we have to surrender. We can't fight 80 cops. Even if we could, what's the point? We killed 15 people. We're going to prison for life or getting executed. Might as well live long enough to explain why we did it." Robert agreed. "We made our point. Every mining company in Kentucky knows what happens when they steal Dixon property. We don't need to die here." Samuel and Thomas nodded reluctantly. The fight was over before it started. At 2:47 p.m., Walter Dixon walked out of his house, hands raised, unarmed. Behind him came Jackson, Robert, Samuel, and Thomas, all surrendering without resistance. No final shootout, no martyrdom, no dramatic last stand. Just 5 men accepting consequences for murders they could no longer justify, even to themselves. Police swarmed them, forced them to the ground, handcuffed them, read them rights they'd violated spectacularly. Captain Barnes stood over Walter. "You killed 15 men over a property dispute," Barnes said. 15 workers with families, with lives, with rights, that superseded your claim to copper you never legally owned. Walter met his eyes. "They were stealing from us. Courts wouldn't help, so we defended what was ours the way mountain men always have." Barnes shook his head. "No, Mr. Dixon. You murdered 15 people because you valued money more than human life. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison understanding that property isn't worth dying for, and it sure as hell isn't worth killing for." As police loaded the 5 Dixon men into vehicles, Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching. Same as every mountain woman who'd watched her family destroyed by violence disguised as honor. The Dixon property, home to 5 generations, was now a crime scene, would be seized to pay damages, would be sold to Fletcher Mining, who'd extract the copper unopposed, who'd make their $4.5 million, while Dixon men rotted in prison. The trial of Walter Dixon and his 4 sons began in March 1985 in a federal courthouse in Frankfort, Kentucky. The venue had been moved from Pike County after defense attorneys argued finding an impartial jury was impossible in a community torn between sympathy for mountain families and horror at 15 murders. 75 combined charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, use of explosives, terrorism under state statutes. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. Forensic links between Dixon weapons and bullets recovered from victims, shell casings from 5 shooting positions, matching family firearms, tire tracks, witness testimony from the worker who survived long enough to identify Samuel Dixon, and Walter's own threats, documented by Fletcher Mining. Most damning were photographs of the crime scene showing bodies scattered around the mine site, the collapsed entrance, equipment destroyed in deliberate fires. The evidence was so overwhelming that conviction seemed inevitable from opening statements. The defense, 4 court-appointed attorneys who looked defeated before jury selection finished, attempted to argue extreme emotional disturbance brought on by corporate theft of family property through legal manipulation. They painted a picture of desperate men driven to violence by a system that protected corporations over families, that enforced 93-year-old mineral rights agreements while ignoring moral claims based on 5 generations of stewardship. They brought in property law experts who explained how mineral rights severance had devastated Appalachian families, how companies exploited legal technicalities to steal wealth from people who'd worked land for generations. They brought in economists who testified about Pike County's economic collapse, about unemployment exceeding 50%, about families with no legal means of survival, watching their one chance at prosperity being stolen through court orders. They brought in psychiatrists who spoke about Walter's PTSD from World War II, about how trauma, combined with desperation, created situations where violence seemed justified. The prosecution destroyed these arguments systematically. Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Morrison was 44 years old, had prosecuted murder cases across Kentucky for 18 years, specialized in dismantling sympathetic narratives, violent men constructed to excuse atrocities. Property disputes don't justify 15 murders, Morrison told the jury during closing arguments. These defendants had legal options, had courts available, had opportunities to appeal, to fight Fletcher's claim through legitimate channels. They chose murder instead. They planned an ambush, positioned themselves with rifles, shot unarmed workers who were just trying to earn wages. They collapsed a mine entrance, trapping 9 men underground to suffocate slowly. They hunted survivors through the forest, executing them while they begged for their lives. This isn't property defense. This is domestic terrorism, mass murder motivated by greed disguised as principle. The only appropriate verdict is guilty on all counts. The jury, 12 people from Frankfort who understood rural poverty but hadn't lived Pike County's specific desperation, deliberated for 22 hours over 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty, all charges, all 5 defendants. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Judge Harold Stevens, 63 years old, 19 years on the bench, looked at Walter Dixon, at his 4 sons, at men who showed varying degrees of remorse but maintained they'd been defending family heritage. Your actions represent complete disregard for human life, Judge Stevens said. 15 men are dead because you valued copper more than their right to live. You planned and executed mass murder, showed no mercy, hunted down survivors like animals. Walter Dixon, death penalty. Jackson Dixon, life without possibility of parole. Robert Dixon, life without parole. Samuel Dixon, life without parole. Thomas Dixon, life without parole. The courtroom was silent as sentences were read. Walter showed no reaction. Jackson wept. Robert stared straight ahead. Samuel and Thomas looked shell-shocked, finally understanding consequences. Elizabeth Dixon collapsed in the gallery, had to be carried out. The Dixon legacy, 137 years of family stewardship, ended in a Frankfort courtroom with 5 life sentences and 15 bodies. Walter Dixon was executed by lethal injection on June 12, 1992, at Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville, 8 years after killing 15 people. He was 69 years old. His final appeals exhausted, clemency denied, Supreme Court refusing to hear his case. The execution was witnessed by families of Fletcher mining workers, by law enforcement officials, by reporters. Walter's last words were brief, unrepentant. "I defended my family's land. Courts failed us, so we defended ourselves. History will judge whether we were criminals or patriots." Then the chemicals flowed and Walter Dixon died, becoming one of the few people executed in Kentucky for property-related murders. Elizabeth had divorced him in 1987, unable to reconcile the man she'd loved with the mass murderer he'd become. She died in 2001, 74 years old, carrying guilt about whether she could have stopped the massacre. Jackson Dixon remains incarcerated at Kentucky State Penitentiary at age 76. Parole denied repeatedly given his life without parole sentence. In a 2018 interview, Jackson said, "I followed my father into darkness because that's what sons do. I've had 34 years to think about the 15 men we killed. Still see their faces, hear them begging. That's my punishment." His wife Sarah divorced him in 1988, remarried, moved to Ohio with their children, who barely remember their father. Robert Dixon died in prison in 2006, age 54, killed during a riot when inmates took over a cell block. Prison records show Robert had been violent throughout incarceration, accumulating infractions, spending years in solitary, becoming more unstable with each passing year. Samuel Dixon remains incarcerated at age 70, has never expressed remorse, maintains they were defending property rights that courts refused to protect. Thomas Dixon, the youngest at 67, remains imprisoned, has become a model inmate, teaches literacy classes, writes letters apologizing to victims' families that most never read. The 15 Fletcher mining workers who died left behind 23 children, 12 widows, dozens of family members destroyed by one night of violence. David Fletcher's widow raised their 4 children alone, never remarried. Marcus Webb's mother, who depended on his income, lost her home within a year, died in a nursing home in 1997. Tommy Vance's 4-year-old daughter grew up without her father, is now 45, works as a social worker in Lexington, rarely discusses her history. The family scattered, some staying in Pike County, most leaving to escape memories. All carry scars that never healed, trauma that passed to children who grew up without fathers because Walter Dixon believed copper was worth more than human life. The Dixon property was seized by the state in 1985, sold at auction to pay restitution to victims' families. Fletcher Mining purchased it for $850,000, extracted the copper over 3 years, made their estimated $4.5 million profit. The mine closed in 1988, was properly sealed, was reclaimed according to environmental regulations. Today, the land where 5 generations of Dixons lived is covered with second-growth forest, nature slowly reclaiming what industrial extraction destroyed. A small memorial marks the massacre site, bronze plaque with 15 names, dedicated by Fletcher Mining in 1995. Local teenagers claim the area is haunted, that on August nights you can hear screaming from underground, can smell gunpowder and fear. Parents tell children to stay away. The land remembers what humans try to forget. Violence soaked too deep into soil to ever wash clean. Pike County's population has dropped below 60,000. Young people leaving, old people staying and remembering. The Dixon name, once respected for 5 generations of stewardship, is now synonymous with mass murder, with property dispute turned massacre, with family legacy destroyed by greed, disguised as principle. 41 years have passed since that August night in Kentucky. The Dixon family legacy, 137 years of farming and stewardship, died with Walter in an execution chamber and with his sons in prison cells. The copper they killed 15 people to protect was extracted by the company they'd tried to stop. The $4.5 million profit going to Fletcher Mining shareholders, while Dixon men rotted in concrete cages. The property dispute that triggered everything was resolved exactly as Walter had feared, with corporations winning and families losing. But the blood he spilled didn't change that outcome, didn't protect anything, didn't accomplish anything except creating 15 more victims and destroying 5 more lives. The uncomfortable truth is that Walter Dixon was right about one thing. The legal system was rigged against families like his. Mineral rights law in Kentucky did favor corporations. Courts wouldn't have protected Dixon claims against Fletcher's 93-year-old documents. But being right about systemic injustice didn't justify 15 murders, didn't make execution of unarmed workers into legitimate property defense, didn't transform mass murder into patriotic resistance. Walter crossed boundaries no human should cross, chose violence when other options existed, convinced himself that heritage and principle justified slaughter. His sons followed because that's what mountain sons do, because family loyalty meant more than morality, because they'd been raised to believe land was worth dying for, and apparently worth killing for. The system that failed the Dixons failed Fletcher's workers too, put them in positions where taking jobs with a mining company meant accepting risks that included being murdered over property disputes they had no stake in. 15 men died because they needed $12 per hour jobs in a county where jobs didn't exist, because courts enforced mineral rights that separated surface ownership from subsurface wealth, because generations of legal and economic decisions had created conditions where desperate people on both sides of a dispute saw violence as their only option. There's no easy answer here, no satisfying conclusion where justice triumphs, just blood and questions and families destroyed on both sides of a conflict that could have been resolved without anyone dying if the legal system protected people instead of property, if economic development had given Pike County options beyond extraction industries, if someone had found middle ground between corporate rights and family heritage. 41 years later, the copper is gone, the bodies are still dead, and nobody can agree whether Walter Dixon was a murderer defending property or a terrorist who dressed up greed as principle. The mountains keep their secrets, offering no answers to questions with no right answers. The Dixon legacy died in execution chambers and prison cells, a family consumed by the same extractive violence they'd tried to resist. Proof that defending property through murder destroys everything you're trying to protect. If this story made you think about property rights, corporate power, and the price paid when desperation meets violence, remember that the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law, but in blood. And Walter Dixon crossed that line. The moment he decided 15 lives mattered less than copper buried in ground his family had walked for 137 years, but never truly owned. The mine consumed everything. the copper, the workers, the Dixon family, and any claim that property disputes justify mass murder. What remains is silence, empty land, and memories of the night Kentucky earth ran red with blood spilled over minerals that belonged ultimately to whoever had better lawyers and older documents, regardless of who'd worked the land or who died defending it.